What if a single stormy night could change everything, turning strangers into family and fear into hope? Stay with me through this story and tell me in the comments the moment that touched you most. If you haven't yet, subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. The storm had a way of swallowing the town hall, turning Portland Harbor into a blur of white and sound. Snow pounded against the old wooden workshop where Ethan Walker was locking up for the night, his gloved hand pressing hard against the heavy door to keep the wind from tearing it open again. He had seen storms before, but not like this. Not in years. The kind of storm that made the world feel smaller, as if nothing existed beyond the swirl of snow and the roar of the ocean. He pulled his collar higher, ready to make the short climb upstairs to the apartment he shared with his daughter, when headlights cut through the blizzard. A pair of beams swept across the frosted windows, too bright, too sudden against the dark. Ethan froze, one hand still on the lock, as a white SUV fishtailed to a stop outside his shop. The engine sputtered against the cold, exhaust rising in uneven bursts before settling into a rough idle. The driver's door opened, and a woman stumbled out, her arms wrapped tightly around a child. For a moment, all Ethan could see was the shape of them, two figures pressed against the wind. Then, through the blur of snow, he caught the pale glint of her face, the desperate way she hunched over the girl in her arms. The child clung to her mother's neck, small fingers curled against a coat too thin for this kind of night. Both of them were trembling, caught between fear and the bitter edge of the cold. Ethan didn't think, he acted. He shoved the door open against the gale, letting the light and warmth of the workshop spill out into the storm. "In here," he called, his voice steady, even as the wind tried to snatch the words away. The woman lifted her head, her eyes finding him in that instant of clarity, and she staggered forward with a strength born only of love and sheer need. By the time she reached him, Ethan was already pulling them inside, pushing the door shut behind them with his shoulder until the latch caught and the roar of the storm dimmed to a muffled howl. She leaned against the wall for a second, breathing hard, her arms still wrapped around the girl. The child's face was pressed against her shoulder, cheeks flushed from the cold, lips pale. Ethan reached for a blanket from the rack by the stove and spread it quickly around them both, the weight of it falling like a promise. He caught her eyes then, wide, alert, and filled with a fear that went deeper than weather. "Upstairs," he said quietly, gesturing toward the narrow stairwell that led to the apartment. The storm might rage outside, but inside, there was fire in the old cast-iron stove, the smell of cedar in the walls, the kind of warmth that could bring life back to frozen hands. She nodded once, unable to speak, and followed where he led. Just like that, on the kind of night no one should have been out, Ethan Walker found himself guiding two strangers into the only safe place he had. What he didn't know yet was that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had driven them here. Upstairs, the air felt different, warmer, softer, touched with the faint sweetness of pine and cedar that had seeped into the beams over decades. Ethan Walker motioned the woman and her child toward the worn sofa near the stove, then stepped back, giving them space. He knew enough about fear to recognize when words were better left unsaid. The storm could batter the windows, but inside there was a quiet that seemed to cradle them. It was the same quiet Ethan had been living with for years, though for him, it had always carried an edge of loneliness. At 30, Ethan's face carried the weathered strength of a man who worked with his hands. But the deeper lines, the shadows in his eyes told a story that wasn't carved by time alone. 5 years earlier, cancer had taken his wife, Sarah. He could still remember the morning light in the hospital room, the way she tried to smile for him, even when the pain was sharp enough to steal her breath. She had been his compass, the steady warmth that made the house more than just walls. When she was gone, it felt as if someone had stripped the color out of his world. All that was left was Mia, their daughter, 10 years old now, growing taller, sharper, stronger every day. She had Sarah's dark eyes and his stubborn jaw. She was the reason he got up each morning, the reason he kept the workshop running even when bills piled up higher than lumber stacks. He worked with wood because it gave his hands something to do when his heart was too heavy to bear. Each table, each chair, every frame, he poured into them what he couldn't say aloud. Grief became grain, sorrow became smooth edges, memory became strength sealed into oak and cedar. The workshop itself was more than a business. His grandfather had opened it in 1947, and the place carried the weight of family history. The floorboards creaked where generations had walked. The tools still bore the wear of calloused hands long gone. To the people of Portland Harbor, Ethan was the man they trusted to mend a staircase or craft a cradle. To Ethan, the workshop was a sanctuary, a place where loss could be shaped into something solid, something useful, something that lasted. Mia understood that in her own way. She would sit on the workbench after school, swinging her legs, asking questions about every tool. She had a favorite blanket, crocheted by Sarah during her first round of chemo, that she still wrapped around herself whenever the wind rattled the windows. Sometimes, when Ethan worked late, he would hear the soft sound of her voice reading aloud from her adventure books, filling the silence that otherwise might have swallowed him whole. It was because of Mia that Ethan had learned to carry his heart more carefully, to be cautious with new people, cautious with hope. Losing Sarah had taught him that love could vanish without warning, like fog rolling back over the harbor. So he lived steady, quiet, reliable. A man who kept promises, who didn't take risks he couldn't control. A man whose whole world revolved around one little girl sleeping upstairs in her room, safe within walls that smelled of pine and memory. Now, watching the storm lash against the windows and the two strangers trembling beneath the blanket, Ethan felt something stir in him, a reminder of the night Sarah had whispered to him, "Take care of her always." He had kept that vow for Mia. Looking at this woman and her daughter, shivering and lost, he sensed the same vow waiting on his tongue. The storm outside raged, merciless and wild, but in Ethan's heart, there was room for shelter. He knew, without quite knowing why, that bringing them inside was more than kindness. It was the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. Lauren Bennett sat very still on the sofa, the blanket wrapped around her, and the little girl who hadn't let go of her neck. The firelight flickered against her face, softening the sharp lines that had once belonged to boardrooms and headlines. She was only 32, yet there was a weariness in her eyes that made her seem older. The kind of weariness that doesn't come from late nights at work, but from years of looking over your shoulder, from battles fought in silence. Not long ago, her name had been spoken with admiration in business circles. The youngest CEO to ever rise through the ranks at Morgan Enterprises, a strategist who seemed to read the market before anyone else. She carried herself with natural authority, the kind that silenced rooms without raising her voice. Her rise was meteoric, her reputation enviable. Yet none of that mattered when she walked through the door of her own home. Behind closed doors, success didn't shield her from Victor Kane. Victor had once been her equal, or so she believed, powerful, confident, born into wealth that stretched back generations. Their marriage began as if it were a merger of empires, two ambitious people mistaking intensity for love. But intensity fades, and what lay beneath was darker than Lauren had ever imagined. Control, manipulation, cruelty so carefully disguised it could pass as concern to anyone who didn't look too closely. The most devastating weapon he wielded was their daughter, Lily. Lily was 7, bright and curious, with a smile that could undo Lauren's exhaustion in an instant. To her, Lily was everything. To Victor, Lily was leverage. He used her in arguments, dangled visitation like a threat, twisted fatherhood into a transaction. When the divorce came, the world only saw headlines. CEO files for divorce. Billionaire husband fights back. What they didn't see were the subtle threats, the way her accounts were frozen overnight, the smear campaigns painting her as unstable, the whispers about her mental health planted in tabloids by men who owed Victor favors. For weeks, Lauren had lived in shadows, hotels paid in cash, names she borrowed for check-ins, rental cars chosen from agencies that didn't ask too many questions. She'd driven down highways she didn't remember, taken exits at random, anything to keep a pattern from forming. She switched phones, pulled dead SIM cards, kept Lily close enough that even sleep felt dangerous. Every night she told her daughter a story to soften the edges of fear, even as her own heart beat with the knowledge that danger could be only a step behind. Still, Victor found ways to remind her of his reach. A tracking device hidden in her car, Strangers who appeared at Lily's school claiming to be consultants, gossip blogs posting photographs she had never posed for. All of it pressed like a weight against her chest, convincing her that there was no corner of the world beyond his shadow. Until tonight, until this storm, until the moment she pulled off the road, desperate for safety, and stumbled into the doorway of a man she barely remembered meeting. She tightened the blanket around Lily now, eyes fixed on the floor as though admitting any of this aloud would make it more real. Inside, the truth burned. She was running out of places to hide. She was a woman who had built empires, who commanded thousands of employees, yet in this storm, all that mattered was keeping her daughter's small hands warm. The rest, money, status, power, was nothing more than snow, swirling into the night. As she felt the quiet strength of Ethan Walker's home wrapping around them, Lauren couldn't help but wonder if, for the first time in years, she had stepped into a place Victor's reach could not follow. A place where the storm outside was not nearly as dangerous as the storm she had been living in. Lauren hadn't expected to recognize him. Not here, not now. But as she lifted her gaze from the child in her arms to the man standing quietly by the stove, the memory came back in fragments. A hall lit with string lights, the murmur of small-town chatter, a fundraiser months earlier where she had tried to blend in and failed. She remembered a rocking chair, handcrafted, smooth as glass, carved from reclaimed ship timber. She remembered pausing just long enough to brush her fingers along its armrest, to nod in appreciation at the craftsman who stood awkwardly nearby, not used to attention. Their exchange had lasted no more than 30 seconds. Yet here he was, Ethan Walker, the same quiet man, now offering her the one thing she hadn't known how to find: shelter. Upstairs, the room carried the glow of the stove, its warmth circling them like a protective hand. Mia appeared from the small bedroom, her dark hair still tangled from where she'd been curled with her book. She stopped short at the sight of her father with two unexpected guests. Lauren instinctively tightened her hold on Lily, but Ethan's voice broke the tension with a calm steadiness. "This is Miss Bennett and her daughter Lily. They'll be staying until the storm passes." That was all he said, but it was enough. Children have a way of finding each other, even when adults hesitate. Within minutes, Mia had disappeared into her room and returned with a blanket stitched in soft blues and greens, the one Sarah had crocheted during her first round of chemotherapy. She draped it across Lily's shoulders without ceremony, then crouched near the stove to show her how to hold a marshmallow over the open door. Lily's eyes widened, her shyness slowly melting as the sugar browned and bubbled. The two girls leaned in together, whispering in the language only children understand, their giggles rising each time the marshmallow caught fire and had to be blown out. Ethan watched from across the room, his chest tightening in a way he hadn't expected. The sound of laughter, unrestrained, childlike, alive, was something his apartment hadn't known in too long. It rushed in like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Lauren sat stiffly on the sofa at first, posture tense, eyes darting to every sound outside. But even she couldn't help glancing toward the stove, watching her daughter laugh for the first time in days. Her shoulders softened, her lips pressed together, holding back a smile that wanted to break free. For Ethan, the moment felt oddly familiar. He had seen Lauren once before, standing among businessmen and donors, commanding attention in a way she hadn't even seemed to notice. Back then, he'd thought of her as someone from another world, polished and untouchable. Tonight, she looked nothing like that woman. The heels she wore clicked awkwardly against the old wooden steps. Her coat was dusted with snow. Her eyes carried the kind of fear you can't buy your way out of. Yet, beneath it all, she was still the same woman who had paused to admire a chair he'd poured months of work into. He set a mug of tea on the table beside her, the handmade clay edges imperfect but sturdy. Lauren wrapped her fingers around it, her hand trembling only slightly as warmth seeped through. She glanced at him then, just briefly, as if to acknowledge the small act of kindness. For a man like Ethan, it wasn't much. For a woman like Lauren, it might have been more than she could say. The storm pressed harder against the glissade, rattling the windows. But inside, the sound of two girls' laughter filled the space that grief had hollowed. For the first time in years, Ethan's home felt less like a shelter from the world and more like the beginning of something new. something alive. Though neither he nor Lauren spoke of it, they both felt the same fragile truth settle between them. Fate had brushed them past each other once before, and tonight, in the middle of the storm, it had brought them back. Lauren sat on the edge of the sofa, her posture a study in restraint. Even as the warmth of the stove washed over her and the girls' laughter drifted through the room, her body refused to loosen. Her eyes kept sliding toward the door, then the window, then the narrow staircase they had just climbed. Every sound from outside, a gust of wind rattling the shutters, a loose branch scratching against the siding, pulled her attention as if danger might burst through at any moment. She sipped the tea Ethan had given her, but her hand hovered near her pocket each time she set the mug down, checking for the phone that no longer had a signal. Ethan noticed. He noticed the way her shoulders never dropped fully, the way her breath caught at each creak of the floorboards. He had seen that kind of vigilance before, not in boardrooms or business leaders, but in neighbors who had fled bad marriages, in friends who had returned from deployments, carrying battles that never made it into the history books. It was the posture of someone who lived in survival mode, someone whose fear had nothing to do with storms and everything to do with the shadow of another person. He set his mug down on the table, the handmade clay catching the light. Then he leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice low, steady, deliberate. "You're safe here," he said. The words were simple, almost ordinary, but the weight behind them was not. They carried the promise of a man who meant exactly what he said. Lauren looked at him, her eyes flicking up for the briefest moment. There was disbelief there, the kind that comes from too many broken assurances, but also a flicker of something else. Hope, maybe. She pressed her lips together, as though afraid that if she spoke, the moment would shatter. Her hand tightened around the mug, drawing warmth into her palms as if to anchor herself. The girls giggled from their place near the stove. Mia had drawn a smiley face into the fog on the window, and Lily laughed as she added whiskers to make it a cat. Their voices rose and fell in a rhythm that felt natural, innocent, untouched by the heaviness in the room. For a heartbeat, Lauren's face softened as she watched them, the corners of her mouth lifting, almost against her will. Ethan saw the mother beneath the CEO, beneath the armor. He leaned back, giving her space, but he didn't look away. He wanted her to know she was being seen, not judged, not questioned, just seen. He had learned with Sarah that sometimes words weren't what mattered most. Sometimes it was presence, sitting through the silence, letting someone know they weren't carrying the weight alone. Lauren's gaze dropped again, her knuckles white around the mug, but her breathing began to slow. Not because the danger had passed, it hadn't, but because for the first time in weeks, she wasn't running. For the first time in weeks, someone had offered her a promise that didn't come with strings or conditions. Just 3 words. "You're safe here." Outside, the storm howled like it meant to tear the world apart. Inside, the air grew a little lighter. The girls' laughter filled the corners of the room. The fire burned steadily, warming the cedar beams and the people beneath them. Lauren, though she didn't say it aloud, allowed herself to believe, if only for tonight, that the storm could rage all it wanted. Here, within these walls, safety was not just a word, it was a promise. And Ethan Walker was a man who kept his promises. The fire had burned low, its glow soft against the cedar walls. Maya and Lily were curled in blankets on the rug, whispering to each other until sleep finally claimed them. The hush that followed left only the sound of the storm pressing against the glass and the faint whistle of wind through the eaves. Lauren sat across from Ethan, her hands wrapped tightly around the empty mug he'd given her earlier, as though she needed something solid to hold on to before the words came. She hadn't intended to share. For weeks she had carried it all in silence, believing that speaking it aloud would make it heavier, more dangerous. But something about the steadiness in Ethan's eyes, the way he'd said, "You're safe here," gave her permission. Her voice was low, careful, almost as if she feared the walls themselves might betray her. "Victor doesn't lose," she said finally. "Not because he's stronger, not because he's smarter, but because the world is built to let him win." Ethan didn't interrupt. He only nodded slightly, urging her on. His father is a federal judge. His uncle runs one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast. His best friend from Princeton controls a private security company that contracts with half the state. And his golf partners, she gave a short, bitter laugh. One is the deputy chief of police, another sits on the state Supreme Court. That's his circle. That's the net around him. I file complaints, they disappear. I go to court and the paperwork gets lost. Every time I tried to stand up, the ground was already tilted beneath me. She paused, drawing in a shaky breath, her fingers trembling around the mug. When I filed for divorce, he laughed, said I wouldn't last a year outside his shadow, that I'd never work again. When the court granted me custody of Lily, he smiled like it was a game he'd already decided to win. And then the story started. Articles whispering that I was unstable, gossip blogs claiming I'd had breakdowns, complete with doctored photos of clinics I've never set foot in. Suddenly, every boardroom looked at me differently. Not as a CEO, not as a strategist, but as a woman who might be too fragile to trust. Her eyes finally lifted to meet Ethan's, carrying exhaustion, but also defiance, the flicker of someone who refused to be erased. He calls me unfit, says I'm reckless, unwell, dangerous even. He doesn't have to prove it, he just has to say it, and the world nods along because his money, his name, his power, those weigh more than truth. Ethan leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. He recognized the edge in her voice, the despair of someone trapped in a fight rigged from the start. It wasn't unlike the helplessness he had felt watching Sarah fade, except this was no disease. This was cruelty by design. He uses Lily against me, Lauren whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. Every phone call, every meeting, every threat, she's the pawn. He doesn't see her as a child, not really, just leverage. And every day I run, I wonder how long before he finds us again. The room was silent but for the storm. Ethan let the quiet stretch, steady and unhurried. Then, in a voice low enough that it felt like a bow, he said, "He may have power out there, but in here with me, he doesn't." Lauren swallowed hard, her throat tight, but something in her posture shifted. The fear was still there, but so was a small piece of trust. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't just running, she was being heard. The night had grown deeper, the storm outside still raging with a kind of merciless rhythm. Ethan had risen once to stoke the fire, careful not to wake the girls, then settled back into the chair opposite Lauren. Her confession still hung between them, raw and heavy, yet in the quiet afterward, something like peace had started to settle. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't carrying it alone. Then Ethan froze. A sound, low, steady, unnatural against the howl of the wind. He moved quietly to the window, staying to the side, peering through a narrow crack in the curtain. Headlights, not moving, just sitting there in the swirling snow. A second pair appeared, then a third, positioning themselves in a wide arc across the street. The storm should have made travel impossible. Yet here they were, 3 vehicles idling, patient as predators. He turned back toward Lauren. She was already standing, her hand tightening on the sofa's armrest, her body rigid with the recognition of a hunted animal. She didn't ask, she didn't need to. She had been expecting this moment. "They found us," she whispered, her voice thin. Ethan crossed the room, steady and controlled. "Get the girls. Keep them away from the windows." Lauren moved quickly, kneeling beside Lily, who stirred under her blanket but didn't wake. Mia blinked, rubbing her eyes, confused by the tension suddenly thick in the room. Lauren pressed a finger to her lips, urging silence. When she straightened, something caught her eye. Lily's stuffed rabbit, Mr. Buttons, had slipped partly from beneath the blanket. Lauren reached to tuck it back in but paused. A tiny glint, barely visible. She picked up the toy and turned it over in her hands. There, under the seam of its ear, a blinking green light. Her stomach dropped. The words came out in a rasp. "Oh my God, he put it in her toy." Ethan was beside her in an instant, his jaw tightening as he took the rabbit gently from her hands. The device was no bigger than a coin, the LED pulsing with quiet precision. He didn't need to say it, but he did, for her sake. "It's a tracker." Lauren's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. The one thing Lily never let out of her sight, The objects she carried from city to city, from motel to motel, had betrayed them. A gift from Victor on her birthday, something meant to soothe a child twisted into a weapon. Lauren pressed a hand over her mouth, fighting the wave of nausea that rose at the thought. He always knew, she whispered. Every mile, every turn, he wasn't guessing. He was watching. Ethan crouched so he was level with her, his voice calm but firm, anchoring her in the storm that was no longer just outside. You found it. That matters. It means we can take it away from him now. But we have to move right now. Through the window, the glow of headlights cut sharper against the snow. Figures shifted in the dark, just beyond the reach of the floodlight. Men waiting, calculating, patient. Ethan felt the old instincts rise, the same instincts that had once kept him alive in places far from Portland Harbor. He wasn't just a carpenter, not tonight. Tonight, he was the barrier between those men and the two little girls sleeping upstairs. Lauren's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but there was steel in her voice when she answered, "Tell me what to do." In that moment, Ethan realized she was no longer just a woman running. She was a mother ready to fight, and she would not run alone. The room seemed smaller now, the air pressed tight with urgency. Lauren clutched Lily against her chest while Mia stood close beside Ethan, her eyes wide, sensing far more than a child should. Outside, the storm howled, but beneath it came the low hum of engines. 3 of them, steady, circling like wolves that had caught the scent. Ethan's mind moved quickly, his voice calm though his heart was pounding. "There's a way out," he said, already pulling a worn envelope from the drawer near the workbench. He sketched a quick map with the precision of a man used to thinking under pressure. Behind the workshop is the loading dock. From there, follow the tree line. About a quarter-mile in, you'll find a fishing cabin. It belongs to David Miller, our sheriff. He keeps it stocked for emergencies: food, water, radio. It's your safest chance until the storm breaks. Lauren's grip tightened around Lily. "What about you? I'll buy you time." Ethan shoved a flashlight and a set of keys into her free hand. The blue key opens the dock. David's cabin has a red door. You can't miss it. Spare key is under a fake rock by the left porch rail. His eyes met hers, steady as oak. "You get them there. Don't look back." Before she could answer, a vibration buzzed against his thigh. Ethan pulled his phone from his pocket. No name, just an unknown number. But he didn't need a name. He knew. He pressed answer and held the phone to his ear, his voice flat. "Walker." The reply came smoothly, cultured, almost polite. "Mr. Walker, I believe you have something that belongs to me." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I have 2 guests who needed shelter from a storm. That's not a crime, last I checked." Victor Kane's laugh was sharp, like glass breaking. "Don't insult me. I know exactly who you are. Small-town carpenter, widower, struggling to keep the lights on, raising a daughter on your own, honorable discharge from the Navy, clean record except for a few late mortgage payments when your wife was sick. You've stepped into something far bigger than you can handle." Ethan paced slowly across the room, watching the shadows move outside the window. "I know enough. I know a bully when I hear one." "You think this is bullying?" Victor's tone hardened, though he still wrapped it in feigned concern. "I'm a father trying to protect his child from an unstable mother. Did she tell you about her breakdowns, the medication she's supposed to be taking? The restraining orders I filed to keep her from harming herself or Lily? I have documentation, medical records, police reports, witnesses. You're harboring a dangerous woman, Walker, and you're putting your own daughter at risk." Ethan's voice didn't rise. It settled deeper, steady as the beams holding up the roof. "What I know is this. I've got security cameras recording since the moment your vehicles pulled up. They'll show armed men outside my workshop, threatening a mother and 2 kids. They'll show you violating the law in about 6 different ways. When the storm clears, those Fed recordings will find their way into the right hands." There was silence on the line, broken only by the storm battering the windows. Then Victor's civility cracked. "You have no idea what you're risking. I can destroy you, your business, your reputation, your entire life in this pathetic town. 3 phone calls, that's all it takes." Ethan exhaled slowly. You've already lost the only thing that matters. She's not afraid of you anymore, and neither am I. He ended the call without waiting for an answer. Turning back, he pressed the envelope map into Lauren's trembling hands. She looked at him as though she wanted to argue, to refuse, but she saw the resolve in his eyes. He had already made his decision. Go, he'd whispered. Take them now. Though her heart broke at leaving him behind, Lauren nodded, because in that moment, she understood. Ethan Walker was a man who would stand against the storm, even if it meant facing the devil himself. The door closed behind Lauren and the girls, the sound swallowed by the storm. Ethan gave them a minute, maybe less, listening for the faint creak of the back stairwell, the whisper of wind as the loading dock opened and shut. Then he moved. The workshop wasn't just a business. It was a map etched into his bones. Every beam, every tool, every shadow held possibility. Tonight, it would become a fortress. He worked quickly, hands sure despite the adrenaline pounding in his veins. Aircraft cables stretched low across the main aisle, invisible in the dark, strong enough to trip a running man. Stacks of oak planks were nudged into precarious balance, ready to thunder down at the tug of a cord. Cans of stain and varnish were positioned high, ready to spill slick across the floor. He checked the weight of the workbench his grandfather had built, solid enough to stop more than lumber if it came to that. Every move was calculated, every trap designed to buy just a little more time. The front door exploded inward. 4 men stormed in with military precision, flashlights mounted on rifles sweeping arcs across the room. Mercenaries, not security guards. Professionals trained to move fast, to clear corners, to end things before their target even understood what was happening. The first one hit the tripwire, his body crashing forward as a rain of oak planks fell from the loft above. His weapon clattered out of reach, his shout drowned by the storm outside. The second pivoted to cover, only to meet the concrete floor head first when his boot caught the same cable. Ethan was on him before he could recover, locking an arm around his throat until the fight drained from his body. The third moved more slowly, cautiously, his beam cutting through the maze of saws and lumber. Ethan stayed low, circling opposite, using every creak and corner he knew better than his own heartbeat. The workshop had been his sanctuary, and now it became his battlefield. Then came the voice, smooth, mocking, amplified through a megaphone. "This is pointless, Walker. We know she's not here anymore. My men tracked them toward the tree line. But you interest me, the loyal craftsman protecting the damsel. How quaint." Victor Kane stepped inside, his coat dusted with snow, his expression that of a man strolling into his own parlor. He stayed behind his men, of course, letting them shoulder the risk, his smile cutting sharp in the dim light. "Did she promise you money, Walker? Or something more personal? You're risking your life for a woman you barely know. Tell me, does she remind you of your dead wife?" The words landed like a blade. For a moment, Ethan's chest tightened, Sarah's memory pressing raw against his ribs. But grief had sharpened him, not weakened him. He stepped out from cover, his voice steady, low, unyielding. "I'm helping her because I know what it's like to watch someone you love fight something that's trying to destroy them. The difference is Sarah's enemy was a disease. Lauren's enemy is you, and you chose to be a monster." Victor's smile slipped, just slightly. He motioned to the last mercenary. "End this." The rifle came up, a red dot blooming against Ethan's chest. He dove behind the saw table, the crack of gunfire splitting the air, wood splintering above his head. Then, cutting through storm and chaos, came the sound that shifted everything. Sirens, multiple, growing louder. The high wail of police cruisers fighting their way through the blizzard. Victor's face hardened, calculation replacing arrogance. He had minutes, maybe seconds. Outside, red and blue lights cut through the snow as vehicles skidded to a halt. Doors slammed, shouts carried, and then a familiar voice boomed through the loudspeaker. "David Miller, Sheriff, friend, Kane, step out now, hands where we can see them." Victor hissed under his breath, retreat already written in the tension of his shoulders. "This isn't over, Walker. Lawyers, judges, politicians, I own them all. You've made an enemy you can't fight." Ethan stayed behind the bench, his breathing steady, His body braced for one last strike, but the mercenaries obeyed Victor's signal, pulling back toward the snow, vanishing into the white glare of headlights. Within moments, the vehicles were gone, swallowed by the storm. The workshop filled with the sound of law and order, boots on wood, radios crackling, weapons lowered. David strode in, taking in the wreckage, the fallen planks, the unconscious man, the shattered door. He met Ethan's eyes, a silent exchange of trust, of relief. Lauren and the girls were safe. The storm still raged, but the worst of the night had passed, and Victor Kane, for the first time, had been forced to run. Spring arrived quietly in Portland Harbor, almost shy at first. The snow receded in slow patches, giving way to wet earth and stubborn shoots of green. The harbor, once locked under winter's grip, shimmered back to life with the sound of gulls and the steady rhythm of waves against the pier. Months had passed since that night when headlights had glared through the storm and Victor Kane had been forced to retreat, and everything had changed. The evidence Ethan had gathered, the security footage, the tracker sewn into Lily's stuffed rabbit, the testimonies that followed, had been more than enough. Victor now faced federal charges that even his network of influence couldn't dissolve. His name, once a symbol of untouchable power, was dragged into courtrooms and headlines for the truth it had hidden. For Lauren, it wasn't victory she savored, but relief that Lily could walk to school without shadows trailing her, relief that nights could pass without fear of an engine idling outside her door. She had rented a modest Victorian just 2 streets over from Ethan's workshop. It was nothing like the penthouse she had once called home, but in its peeling paint and uneven floors, she found something she had never known before: peace. Portland Harbor wasn't a hiding place. It had become a choice, and staying close to Ethan felt less like survival, more like beginning again. The children had blossomed, as if the thaw belonged to them. Mia and Lily became inseparable, spending afternoons building forts out of driftwood, whispering secrets under blankets, laughing in ways that reminded Ethan of a life he thought he had lost. Mia had grown lighter, freer, as though having a sister in all but name had filled a space that had been too quiet since Sarah's passing. Lily's fear faded too, replaced by curiosity, by joy, by the unguarded spirit of a child finally allowed to be one. Slowly, gently, Ethan and Lauren found themselves sharing more than worry. There were mornings when they traded the school drop-off, evenings when they cooked together in kitchens that smelled of garlic and laughter, weekends when walks along the beach became routine. What had started as a necessity deepened into a rhythm, the kind of rhythm families discover not by planning, but by choosing again and again to show up for each other. One late afternoon, with the tide low and the sun soft against the water, the 4 of them walked along the rocks to where the harbor seals rested. The girls ran ahead, their voices carried on the wind. Ethan and Lauren followed, their steps slow, easy, almost in sync. "Dad," Lily called suddenly, her small hand slipping into Ethan's, the word tumbling out as naturally as breath, her smile bright as she pointed toward a seal balancing on the pier post. Ethan felt the world tilt, his chest tightening with something so fierce and tender, it almost brought him to his knees. Before he could respond, Mia wrapped her arms around Lauren's waist, her voice muffled but certain. "Mom." Lauren froze, her eyes wide, then softening as she bent to hold the girl close. She looked over Mia's dark head to find Ethan's gaze, and in that instant, they both knew. This wasn't chance anymore, nor was it a temporary shelter from storms. This was home. Ethan squeezed Lily's hand, his other arm instinctively reaching for Lauren. Their eyes held, full of tears they didn't try to hide. They weren't just survivors of broken pieces, they were builders now. Builders of something whole, something lasting. The seals barked across the water. The children's laughter rose high into the evening air. And for the first time in years, Ethan and Lauren understood that they weren't waiting for life to begin again. It already had. It looked exactly like this. A family formed not by blood alone, but by choice, by love, and by the courage to stay when the storm had passed. In the heart of a ferocious Portland Harbor storm, Ethan Walker, a grieving single father, opened his workshop door to Lauren Bennett, a CEO on the run, clutching her daughter Lily against the howling wind. What unfolded wasn't just a refuge from the blizzard, but a profound lesson in the power of compassion and resilience. Ethan, shaped by the loss of his wife, saw past Lauren's polished exterior to the fear of a mother fleeing a manipulative ex-husband. His quiet offer of safety, "You're safe here," and his fierce stand against Victor's mercenaries revealed that true strength lies not in wealth or status, but in the courage to protect others, even at great personal risk. Lauren, once untouchable in boardrooms, found freedom not in power but in the warmth of a home where laughter replaced fear. Their story, woven with Mia and Lily's giggles, teaches us that family isn't just born, it's chosen, built from shared scars and persistent hope. Ethan's workshop, a sanctuary of cedar and memory, became a fortress against cruelty, showing that kindness can dismantle even the most formidable threats. This tale stirs the heart, reminding us that in our darkest storms, a stranger's compassion can light the way to healing. It challenges us to look beyond appearances, to offer shelter, literal or emotional, when someone's world is collapsing. The moment Lily called Ethan dad and Maya called Lauren mom captures the beauty of rebuilding life from broken pieces, evoking tears for the pain endured and joy for the love reclaimed. Which moment in Ethan and Lauren's journey hit you hardest? Was it Ethan's unwavering stand or the children's innocent bond that formed a family? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm eager to hear what moved you. If stories of resilience and chosen family tug at your soul, hit subscribe and join our community for more tales that remind us to keep building, keep loving, no matter the storm. Your voice matters. Let's connect.